right, so I'm going to get right down to business. So today I'm starting a brand new series on the family, and I'm calling it, guess what, The Family Circus. How many of you grew up reading Bill Keene's comic strip, The Family Circus? How many of you? Most of you in the room. Here's a picture of it in case you haven't seen it. And I grew up, he started writing it in 1960, so I grew up reading this whole thing, and I think it had the distinction of being the least funny comic strip in the entire funnies page. Even when I was a kid, I never thought it was funny, never thought it was funny as an adult. And you know, other people didn't think it was funny either, including Mad Magazine, and they used to mock it, and they used to do their own kind of version of it. And here's one of them, I love it. You made this car all by yourself? It sucks. See, that's super funny. It's also excellent parenting, and they're not Bill Keene, it's Bill Spleen. And then there was this other group, they came up with the dysfunctional family circus. There's not many of these I can show you, but I can show you this one. Look at this, he's putting something down the carburetor, and it says, false alarm, Dad, it wasn't the cops, just the mailman. Again, super funny. See, he could have made these funny, he just didn't. Incidentally, it wasn't actually called Family Circus in the beginning, it was called The Family Circle. But how many of you remember there was a magazine called The Family Circle, and they sued him, and he had to change the name, so he changed it to Family Circus rather. And his son, Jeff, still writes it today. Did you know that? It's still going on. Little Jeffy, the one in all the little bubbles, right? And so, anyway, that's just an aside. I thought, what better an example for the family than the Family Circus, right? I mean, it's loud, it's chaotic, it's energetic, it's unpredictable, and it's always entertaining, right? But when you think of the circus, I'm wondering, how many of you grew up in Winnipeg going to the Shrine Circus? Anybody remember that? I'm telling you, that was a huge thing back in the day, and my grandmother used to take us every year, and I looked forward to the Shrine Circus. Because in those days, in the 60s and the 70s, where were you going to see live elephants? Where were you going to see, tigers and lions and people sticking their heads in a lion's mouth? You're just not going to see that anywhere. And so I looked forward to that all year long. I really miss the Shrine Circus. But the biggest circus of them all, the greatest show on earth was what? Yeah, the Barnum, the P.T. Barnum. Actually, here's the story behind it. It's fascinating. The 5 Ringling Brothers joined up with P.T. Barnum and James Bailey, and they formed the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, a lot of names, circus, and it became the greatest show on earth. These showmasters all got together and pooled their resources and made this incredible, incredible show. There really was the greatest show on earth. At one point, they had 40 elephants in their routine. And in 1871, they pioneered what we know today as the 3-ring circus. And the 3-ring circus was here's a picture of it, by the way. And some of you remember this. Even the Shrine Circus did the 3-ring circus. They all copied it. And there was 3 rings all going at once. And so you'd have the main ring in the middle, but you'd have these other rings. And so it was always going like this. It was always popping along, and you had to keep your eyes on this the whole time. And of course, they just were absolutely over the top, Barnum and Bailey. And in 2017, they got closed down. They went out of business after 146 years. And do you know who put them out of business? Do you know? The animal rights activists, actually. And they could not take it that there was these animals in captivity, and it just was not an appetite for that anymore. And what are you going to do if you've got no elephants and no lions and no tigers and no monkeys and no horses? You don't have much of a show left. And so they had to go out of business. But here's the good news in this. As long as there is the family, there will be wild animals in captivity. And there will be the 3-ring circus that will go on forever. And so that's my message over the next few weeks. I'm going to be talking about the 3-ring circus of the family. And the 3 rings are going to be relationship, a responsibility. That's going to be one I'm really dig into that one, I'll tell you. And then recreation. And so we all know, what the 3 rings of marriage are. I've told you this before. They are the engagement ring, the wedding ring, and the suffer ring. but for family, what we have to do is we have to take these three things: relationship, responsibility, and recreation. Let's not leave that out of this. And we have to balance these things, and you have to do them all simultaneously. You don't just do one or the other. And no family can survive without all three of these rings existing simultaneously and doing well on each one of these things. So I'm going to be speaking, we're not going to be talking about marriage or parenting necessarily. We're going to be talking about the family in general. But I do want to talk to most of you, because you know who you are in the circus. Some of you think you're the clown. I know that's how your kids treat you. Some of you are wild animals, I get that. But I'll tell you who you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be the ring master. If you are the parent, you are the ring master. It's not your 5-year-old son. It's not your 14-year-old daughter. You are the ring master. And the ring master is the master of ceremonies, the artistic director. They're the ones that keeps everybody's attention. They are the ones that is able to balance this incredible cacophony of noise and action and keep it all together and keep it all moving along. And you've all seen them in their flash and their dazzle and their bow tie and their top hat and their red tuxes. And there's nothing quite like the ring master. So as we're going through this, keep imagining yourself that this is your circus and you are the ring master. So as we go to the first ring, which I'm going to refer to as relationship, I'm only going to talk about two things today. And of course, there's many more than that in relationship and many more things in family than these two things. But if you can get these two things figured out, you can go a long way with them. And here's what they are. They are commitment and they are communication. And so the first one, and we're going to be using the circus as our metaphor along the way here. And the first one, of course, is communication. But before we get there, I want to go to my text. And I want to talk about what God has to say about this. And this text is going to kind of predominate through this whole series. And it's the last book in the Old Testament, the only Italian prophet that ever was, Malachi. Do you remember Malachi? And I had some people get so mad at me last time I did that. They said, Pastor Mark, it's pronounced Malachi, not Malachi. To which I said, how do you know how it's pronounced? Do you speak Chaldean? I mean, who knows? It could be just as easily pronounced Malachi. And my mom's Italian, so I'm going with Malachi, the Italian prophet. He had something to say to us. So I'm just going to read the last two verses, saying that to our tech people up there, verse 4 and 5. And this is what it says. It says, behold, I send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. Interesting to me that the very last thing that God said in the entire Old Testament was about the family. Don't you find that interesting? I mean, he could have said anything. He could have been talking about the coming Messiah. You would have thought that that's what he would have said. But he didn't. He said, here's what I'm going to do in the very last, in the very end. I'm going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the father. And he says, here's what happens if that doesn't happen. I will strike the earth with a curse. Or in other words, the earth will be under a curse when the family falls apart. How many feel like that's happening right now? How many feel like the earth feels like they are well heading into that realm where we are cursed? It feels so broken, the family today. And as I said, we're going to talk about that more next week. I'm going to try to give you more of a lighthearted message tonight and set some groundwork and really try to be practical and give you some tools in your belt to help you in this journey of being the ring master. And so he says this, he says, I'm going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. And the first way that he does that is in the area of commitment. When I'm talking about commitment, we could talk about a bunch of things. We could talk, again, I mean, it's quite broad where you could go with this. You could talk about unconditional love, and you could talk about, your prayer for your kids and all these things. But what I want to talk about is the area of putting in the time. See, let me ask you a question. How many of you like the trapeze? For my money, the trapeze, the flying trapeze, is the, can you show that picture of the flying trapeze? For my money, the trapeze is the most exciting part of the circus. How many are with me on that one? I just am blown away that these people fly. You probably remember the song. He'd fly through the air with the greatest of ease, the daring young man on the flying trapeze. Anybody know that song? Or am I the only one? A few of you. Anyway, here's my question. They make it look so easy, don't they? They just swing from one swing to the other and fly through the air and do 3, 4 flips and grab the other person's hands and swing, and they do it all so casually. How are they able to do it? Anybody want to take a stab at it? Yeah, practice. The amount of time they would have put into this. And see, when people are really, really good at something, they make it look easy, don't they? I mean, when you watch Connor McDavid play hockey, it looks so easy. Or Lionel Messi soccer, or LeBron James play basketball, you think, I think I could do that. I think I could do that. Steve, you probably think that about hockey, right? You watch Connor McDavid, you think, I think I could bounce it off my stick and knock it in from behind the net. Yep. Right? Bet you can't.
I might be able to.
Yeah, you can't do that. Dream on, buddy. And I'll tell you how they got there. They got there through putting in the time. And Malcolm Gladwell, he wrote the book Outliers. He calls it the 10,000 hour rule. And he says, if you're going to master anything in this life, anything, if you're really going to move to the top of what your potential is, you're going to have to put in 10,000 hours of practice. And so, you know, he looks at golfers and he looks at all kinds of people, hockey players, et cetera. I started thinking about this, about parenting. If we're going to be really great parents, how many hours are we going to have to put into it? A lot of hours. And we have a lot of hours. But I want to show you the stats on this because it's kind of interesting. Here they are. Here's the graph. And we'll just look at the last one. It's a little out of date. It's 2010, but it's probably pretty close. And we'll come back to this and look at the increase over time. But fathers are putting in about 7 hours a week, and the mothers about 14 hours, so about twice. And it doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem like enough. But when you start to think about it, particularly the men, you realize that some have a hard time putting in 7 hours a week, because of all the other activities and things they do. And there's other stats out in this that are even lower than that. But let's assume this is true, and let's just do the math that for the fathers here, if you're going to put in 10,000 hours and get really good at it, it's going to take you 30 years. And by then, guess what? Your kids are long gone. By the time you get to your 10,000 hours and you finally become a good parent. This is what Steve was alluding to earlier, wasn't it? And if your kids are still at home at 30, then you have a whole different set of problems that we need to talk about. And so I want to give you I'm going to pick on someone today because I need to give you some biblical basis for some of this. So I'm going to pick on somebody today. And so I'm going to pick on King David. We always talk about him killing Goliath and doing these great swell things. But I'm going to pick on some of his bad behaviors. But first of all, if you were to define David as the biblical Bible does, if you were to get one line to describe David, what would it be? Who remembers how the Bible always describes him? He was a man after God's own heart. It's in Acts chapter 11 or 13:22. And he's a man after God's own heart. And the scripture said he was going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children. And David was definitely a man after God's own heart, but I'll tell you something, he wasn't a man after his children's own heart. And you can go and you can read the stories and you can discover he actually was a terrible parent. And, you understand he was a busy guy, he was doing other stuff. You may or may not know, he didn't have one wife, he didn't have 2 wives, he didn't have 4 wives, he had 8 wives. He has 8 named wives, he has 19 named children. He probably had a lot more than 19 children. He might have had, probably do the math, if you've got 8 wives and he probably had concubines, he probably has 30 or 40 kids. I mean, does he even know all their names? My mother raised 4 kids. And do you know that she could never remember my name? And when she ever referred to me, she always referred to me as Brad, Mark, Todd, Kelly. Brad, Mark, Todd, Kelly. She just names all her sons in a little string, knowing that she'll hit me at some point. And to this day, I'm not sure she's clear on which one I actually am. I'm just not convinced about that. And so anyway, you have David, and David's got all these kids running around. And we know for a fact that he wasn't spending a lot of time with them, and he had one of the most tragic family stories you will ever imagine. And most of you know this, that his son Absalom actually rebelled against him and tried to take the kingdom from him and tried to murder his own father. But see, here's the part that many people don't know. There's a backstory to this. And the backstory is, and just sort of think this through if you could, you've got 8 different wives, you've got 8 different little family groups from the 8 different wives, and so a lot of the brothers and sisters are half brothers and sisters. They're all his kids, but they have different mothers. And so you have his eldest son, whose name was Amnon, and Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar, rapes her. And you know what David did about it? Nothing. He didn't do a thing about it. And so then Absalom, see, here's the backstory on Absalom. Absalom was Tamar's full brother. And when he saw that his father wasn't going to do anything and wasn't going to deal with this, he took matters into his own hand. And who remembers what he did? He killed him. He killed him. Now, of course, that did enrage David. David wasn't very excited about it. Like, you think you got problems with your family. You're probably not killing each other, but you might be. Anyway, and so then Absalom, after he killed his brother Amnon, he flees and he's gone. But the whole time he's bitter. He's estranged from David. Don't miss this. And he's planning a coup d'etat. And that's his intention. And finally, after 3 years, he comes back. And David, being a man after God's own heart, forgave him. But that didn't stop him. He had the plan in the works. And he goes and attempts to usurp his kingdom. And he divides it. And now David has to flee because half of David's men are now fighting against him for Absalom. I mean, talk about a messed up family. And so these guys are literally, they should have been out fighting the Philistines, and they're busy fighting each other within this family. And this is often the thing that happens, is that people hurt the ones they love the most. And then, of course, some of you, maybe you've never read this, but it's an interesting verse. It says that Absalom was the most beautiful man, handsome man that ever lived. And he had long, flowing, luxurious Pantene hair. He looked like Fabio or one of those guys. And so you could imagine him. He was just like stunningly good looking, Brad Pitt good looks and Fabio hair. And so he was going into battle and he was riding through the thicket. I shouldn't think this was funny, but I do. And he got his hair caught in the thicket and he came off of his horse and he was dangling by his hair. Sorry, I'm laughing. It's a sad story. And Joab, one of David's men, came and runs him through with a spear and kills him. And then you have David, who is inconsolable. And he is crying and he's wailing and he's saying, "Oh, Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place." And I don't know about you, but David, too little, too late. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. It's true, and it's a tragic ending. It's a tragic story. And it's what happens when parents wait too long to deal with things, and when they don't put in the time and they don't put in the effort, and then all of a sudden it's passed by and they're in this big mess that is kind of becomes unfixable. And of course he cried, of course he wailed, he lost a son. It was genuine. There's another moral to this story, a little lighter one, and it goes like this. It doesn't matter how beautiful you are, everyone has a bad hair day once in a while, right? I said to my wife the other day, I was doing my hair and I couldn't get it quite right. I said, "I think I'm having a bad hair day." To which she said, "Mark, you have a bad hair day every day." So I want to talk about our families, because I gave you this terrible example, and a lot of us look at that and say, my family's not that bad. Well, I'm glad. But a lot of us have stuff in our families that haven't been great. And I want to look at that graph again, if you can throw that graph up for me. So you can see the parenting is improving. But here's what's fascinating to me. You go back to 1975, let's say. In 1975, the parents were having twice as many kids, but spending half the amount of time with them. And now we're having half as many kids, or a third of the amount of kids, but we're spending more time. And I'm not going to be critical of our fathers. Some of you are more my age, because they had an ethic that they had a particular job, and their job was to earn a living, to bring home the bacon, and to do all that stuff. And it wasn't their job to be raising the kids necessarily. And so some of you in my age group had really difficult upbringings. I know, and I've heard stories, and I know people my age that are still carrying hurts towards their fathers or their mothers or they're both about how they're raised. And I'm always saying, let it go. They probably didn't know any better. You gotta learn how to forgive them. And I don't think I've ever told you this story, but I'm gonna tell you tonight. I may have told it, but I don't think I have. So sometimes I refer to the fact that there was 7 kids in my family, and sometimes I say there's 6 kids. And there's a reason for that. My parents actually had 7 kids, but they only raised 6 of them because one of them died. And the story is tragic. It was Father's Day. And my family, we lived on the Red River on Victoria Crescent right over here. And my parents were on the back deck, and they were having a cup of coffee. And out of my dad's mouth came these words that, "Isn't life grand? We got these wonderful kids and this beautiful home and a wonderful job, and life could not be better." And while he was literally saying those words, my 2 older brothers walked down to the water's edge, we're on the river, and onto the dock. And one of them, the younger one, pushed against the boat. The boat went out, and he fell in between the dock and the boat. And my father was alerted within just moments, but you know what the Red River looks like in June, the current and the color and the brown and whatever. And my father went down, and he dove and he dove and he dove. He finally recovered my brother's lifeless body and brought him to shore, and he was gone. And that tragedy impacted everything about our family because my dad didn't know where to put this. He didn't know how to deal with this. He wasn't a man of strong faith. And unless, I've told you this before, there's probably no greater painful tragedy in a family's life than the loss of a child. It's very hard to find somewhere to put that. You look in Scripture, you'll find the same thing even with David and the loss of his children. And when you're not a man of strong faith, so my father began drinking, immediately stopped going to church, never went to church again, and he buried himself in the work. He put the house out for sale, and we were gone from that house within about 3 weeks. We were out of that house, and we moved away from the river. But my father, and I'm not criticizing him, I'm just telling you this story. I think he was a victim in this. He became emotionally detached. And so on Sunday morning, we would go off to church. And when we got back, my father would sleep in. He always did on Sunday morning. But when we got back from church at noon or 1 or whenever it was, my dad had gone to the office. He went to the office every Sunday afternoon. And then he'd come back for dinner, and I'd say to him, "Why do you have to go to the office every Sunday?" And he said, "Well, I got to keep the wolf away from the door." He always talked in metaphors and cliches and those sort of things. And he probably didn't need to go. He was a lawyer, for goodness sakes. He made lots of money. He didn't need to go to the office on Sunday. But it's what he did, and it's how he managed his grief. And so when I grew up, I don't know what you have to complain about, but when I grew up, my father never came to a single baseball game or a single volleyball game or a single anything game. But there's a whole lot of other fathers that weren't there either. I mean, that was sort of typical for that generation. And when I was 12 years old on Christmas, this is my fondest childhood memory. I'm going to share it with you. On Christmas, when I was 12 years old, he gave me and my older and younger brother this gift, and the 3 of us. And he said, "I'm going to take you guys on this ski trip, and just the 4 of us." And on Boxing Day, just like that, he sprung on us. On Boxing Day, we jumped into his 1964 Buick Wildcat, and the 4 of us went on this ski trip without any plans whatsoever. And we went into Wisconsin and Michigan, to all these little tiny mountains or hills, ski hills. Of course, they seemed like majestic mountains to me, because I'm 12 years old. And I'm telling you, that one experience of spending that 5 days with my dad and my brothers, it was something we didn't do. It was just something we didn't do. And it kind of carried me for years and years and years. And I don't know why he couldn't bring himself to do that. And later, when we were adults, we did it again. 25 years later, me and the same 3 brothers, or same 2 brothers, we did it again. We had the reunion. And those 2 moments just capture this. But I don't want you to miss the fact that there was this painful emotional struggle that existed in our family for so many years, and it carried forth for our entire upbringing. And because when you become emotionally detached, you can't have proper relationship. You have to put in the time. And my father just wasn't capable of doing this. And I'm telling you for this reason, especially those of you that are young parents, we only have one go around at this. You have one go at this. And you know what happens? They're in diapers one day, and they're crawling one day, and they're walking one day, and the next day they're married and they're gone. And you think, whoa, what happened? And I mean, I sometimes go, I've told you this before, I sometimes go into my family room and I look at these pictures of these little kids and I can hardly remember it. And I think, it's gone. I can't believe it. And I said, look at them now, they're so like old. And they were so cute in those days. And I thought if I had to do it over again, and I was a pretty good parent, if I had to do it over again, I'd spend twice as much time with them as I did. And so that's my encouragement to you, is that you gotta put in the time. It's like this woman, she had 4 sons, they all grew up to be career criminals, all ended up in jail. Newspaper reporter said, that's incredible. If you had it all to do over again, would you still have children? She said, sure, just different ones. So the first one is commitment and putting in the time. The second one is communication. And communication is really the key. It's not just the amount of time, but it's what you do with that time, and do you communicate? And when communication breaks down, you're in trouble. So I want to tell you about one of my very favorite speakers in the world. He's actually not a preacher. He's actually a social scientist, and his name is Joseph Grenny. And if you're a leader in this church, I've shown videos of him. And here he is, Joseph Grenny. He says, the truth is you offend more people by what you don't say than what you do. That's just a quote he has. And he has written this book called Crucial Conversations. And Crucial Conversation is tools for talking when stakes are high. And maybe I'll jump to this next slide, the triangle. Here's what he says a crucial conversation is. It's a conversation you're having where you have opposing opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes all working together. So it's not about what are you going to watch on television tonight. It's not about what are we going to have for lunch. It's about when you have these conflicts in our life where they're high stake conflicts and we're high emotions and opposing viewpoints, and we all have them. And he's become an expert. He studied this for 30 years, and this is what he says. He says, the measure of a good relationship, it can be measured. A good relationship can be measured by the lag time between the time a problem is identified and when you start talking about it. And the better the relationship, the shorter that lag time it is. You can get to the talking part about it. And if it's an extended period of time between those two things, if you can't talk about this thing, and it goes on, see, because here's the problem. You will act out what you don't talk out. What you don't speak out, you will act out, and people will do things. They will run away from home, or they'll sleep on the couch, or they'll slam doors, or they'll do whatever. And a lot of people think, well, I think you're just better to let the thing blow over. That's not right. It's like how a husband and wife, they have two different approaches. There's this. The wife will say, our marriage is in trouble, we need to talk. The guy will say, our marriage is in trouble, I better keep my mouth shut. Right? And this is an absolute true story. Are you ready for this? Anna and Lorna Bronkhurst used to watch television together every single night. That was their routine. They would watch television until they fell asleep, and then they'd wander off to bed. And sometimes they would do it, most often they would do it silently, and they would just watch television together. That was their routine. And one night, he went off to bed, and she was still up. And the next night, he did the same thing. And the next night, he did the same thing. And 3 days had gone by before he realized that his wife had been dead for 3 days, and he didn't notice. And so, the measurement of a good relationship is the lag time between when a problem happens and when you notice. If your spouse is dead, that is a problem that you probably need to identify and talk about sooner. And so I want to give you I want to go back to David because I'm picking on him tonight. So David's other big blunder was Bathsheba, right? He committed adultery with Bathsheba, had her husband Uriah murdered. Then he takes her as his wife and has this child with her. Okay, now here's my question for you. How many people knew what had happened? Take a stab at it. You know what the answer is? Everybody. Everybody knew what had happened. He sent for the woman. he sent for her. So all the guards knew, all the servants knew. He brought her into the house, went out of the house, people saw her coming, and then he went and told his captain to put Uriah out in the front, and so that he would be killed. So he knew, and so they knew that he had conspired to have Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, killed. And then he takes the woman into his house as his wife. Everybody saw this happen. Who talked to him about it? Nobody. See, nobody talked to him about it. You know what it says in the book of Proverbs? It says, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. Do you remember who betrayed Jesus with a kiss? It was Judas. Judas went and kissed him, and he betrayed him. Deceitful are the kisses of an enemy, but faithful are the wounds of a friend. What's that talking about? It's talking about the fact that words are actually a faithful thing. If we really care about somebody, if we really have a relationship with them, then we will be willing to have the conversation with them and tell them the truth. And a lot of times we don't believe that. And you know why we don't do it? We think that we have to choose between telling the truth and keeping a friend. Am I right about that? We have a lot of people we won't talk, I'm just going to let it go. And if it is something worth letting go, let it go. But if it's a crucial conversation, if it matters, if the stakes are high, you better talk about it. So I got to tell you a little story that Joseph Grenny talked about in his book that I thought was fascinating. His son is probably going to be a social scientist. So his 10-year-old son watches his dad do all these experiments, so he decides he's going to try one. So he's going to do it at school, and he makes 2 batches of brownies. The first batch, he uses his mom's recipe with sugar and chocolate, and it's all sweet. But in the second recipe, he substitutes the sugar for salt in the same degree, the same amount of salt as the sugar. And then he puts the 2 brownies out in 2 different containers, and he puts a sign over it. One of them says ordinary brownies. The other one says Scott's Super Duper Brownies. And then he has these kids. He says, I'm going to do a taste test for these brownies. I'm going to give you each $1 if you'll participate. And they go, oh, yeah. So he's handing them out a $1 bill. And they go and they eat the first one. You see in the video, you watch them eat the thing. They're chomping away and smiling, the ordinary one. And then they take the one with the salt in it, and they just about gag. And some of them literally spit it out. But then, every last one of them, he asked them this question. He said, which one do you like best? They all pointed to his. They all pointed to Scott's Super Duper Brownies because they didn't want to hurt his feelings. So what it means is that we learn at a very young age to lie to people so we don't hurt their feelings. And consequently, when we get into the conditions that really seriously matter, we don't deal with it. So we have this situation with David, where everybody around him knows what he's done. Everybody. That's my speculation, but I think I'm pretty accurate on it. And no one has the honesty and the concern and the care and the relationship where they're able to come and tell him, except for Nathan. And so Nathan, the prophet, he screws himself up strong so he can do it. And he comes and he tells him a parable. And he doesn't come right out and tell him. He tells him a parable about a rich man who took the sheep of a poor man who only had 1 sheep, and he killed it, and he's fed it to his friends when he had all these sheep himself. And David said, who is this man? That man deserves death. And Nathan said, you are that man. And then David knew. He was convicted to the heart. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. So I'm going to give you I'm going to close with one last story here, maybe 2 last stories. We'll see how this goes. And this one's not a family story. It's one of Granny's stories. It's one of Granny's best stories on this, so I'm going to tell it to you. And I just want you to imagine it's a family member, because it could very well be. Because we typically, well, let me just tell the story. And so he's this expert on relationship, and he was a Cub Scout leader, or Boy Scout, or whatever. And there was another leader by the name of Patrick. And they used to tent together and camp together and do all this stuff together. And then all of a sudden, Patrick disappeared, and he hadn't seen him for 10 years. And one night, there's a knock on the door, and Patrick's at the door. And he says, Patrick, I haven't seen you for ages. Where you been? He said, well, I haven't been good. He says, I got into drugs, and I got into some criminal activity. I've ended up in jail. I've been a real mess for 10 years. That's why you haven't seen me. he says, but I really want to turn my life around. And he says, this is what I thought. I thought, who do I have in my life? Who do I know that I can really, really trust? And the only person that came to mind was you. Now, I want you to think about this story for a moment. You see, because most of the time, when somebody really messes up their life, who do they go to? They actually go back to their families. Because their families are the ones they know that truly, really love them at the end of the day. So he said, so I've come to you, you're the only one I could think of. And so he says, can you help me? He says, yes, of course I can help you. So a bunch of things transpired, and one of the things was he started this little business, and he needed to buy a truck, and Joseph co-signed for the truck, and he was making the payments, and it was all going pretty good for a while, and then all of a sudden he disappeared again. And so that was it. So he thought, well, maybe I'll never see him again. So then, in the course of time, there were some weird things happening in his house. And one night when they were out, their house got broken into and some stuff got stolen, and they were pretty upset about this. They felt really violated, so they decided to put up a security system and some cameras around their house. So a couple of months later, the house was broken in again, but this time they had the security cameras up, and when they looked at the video, yeah, you guessed it, it was Patrick that had gone through the basement window, stolen some of their valuable things, gone out the front door, and he couldn't believe it. Now, he hadn't seen Patrick for months. He didn't know where he was, didn't know how to get a hold of him, and so he didn't do anything about it at that moment. One day, he's driving down the road, not near their house, and he's driving down the road, and he sees Patrick on the sidewalk. And he pulls over and rolls down his window, and he says, Patrick. Patrick stiffens up like this. He says, Patrick, it's fine. I just want to talk. Come on, hop in the car. So he gets in the car, and they're sitting there together. He says, why don't you come over, and we'll have lunch. And he drives him to his house and feeds him lunch. And then he says, oh, I have a video I want to show you. And he says, come on down. And so they go down to the basement, and he puts in the tape or whatever it was, the DVD or however it was. He sticks it in and turns on the television. And then he turns to Patrick. He says, Patrick, before I show you this video, I want to ask you a question. You know that I love you, right? And he nodded, and he says, I know you do. He said, good, let's just keep that in mind. And then he ran the tape, and there Patrick was watching a video of him breaking into Joseph's house. And he just began to sob. He just began to sob and sob and sob. And then he turned up and he said, what are you going to do? He says, I'm not going to do anything. I've already sent the tape to the police. They already have it. And if you choose to turn yourself in, then that would be your decision. I told you I loved you. But I love you enough that I'm going to tell you the truth. That I know you were the thief, and I know you were the one that broke into my house. And so you'll have to decide what you're going to do then. And he cried some more, and he said, I need to turn myself in, and I need to go to jail, and I need to make this right. And I want you to think of this in terms of your family, because we have stuff in our family, and we think we can just let the things go. And sometimes we need to get that crucial conversation going, and we need to get to it. And if we don't get to it, that thing will just fester, and people will act out before they speak out. And there's a way of doing it by speaking the truth in love, because faithful are the wounds of a friend, but deceitful are the kisses of an enemy. I had a whole lot more I needed to tell you about tonight, so I'm going to have to save it to next week, because I'm going to tell you how to do those crucial conversations. So we're going to leave that to next week, but let's stand together, shall we?